It's a nested hierarchical watershed framework. And what you'll notice is that these watershed boundaries do not coincide with the boundaries of the park. And what's important to realize is that those watersheds, because they are outlining the biophysical template, they drive a lot of the patterns and processes in the park. So if you're really interested in managing resources within the park, you have to think about how the landscape actually functions. And if you want to think about that, you have to look at watershed boundaries. So when you start to take a look at the bigger picture, you realize that there are actually a lot of potential threats to resources within the park. We have dam operations, which I'll go into a bit later. Extirpated native species, we have about 10 species that have been extirpated that we know about, some of which are keystone species like wolves and river otters. Non-native species, we have non-native trout that outcompete and prey upon native species. We have user impacts, about 4.5 million visitors a year, despite some folks' best efforts, have a significant impact on the resource. With altered disturbance regimes, such as altered fishing in the forested habitat types. We have mining, both historic mining and current mining. Uranium has obviously been in the news a lot lately, but that can have and has had a significant impact on resources within the park. Regional water usage is another issue that's been in the news, local news lately, with the proposed development in Tucson, and that could potentially have some severe impacts on park resources, particularly on the springs and seeps that, as I indicated, drive a lot of the biodiversity that we see in the park. Water pollution, again, looking at those watershed boundaries, all of those waters originate in one way or another outside of the park boundaries. Air pollution, again, another issue, and you can see here an image of a clear day at the park and a not so clear day at the park. There's been some good progress made in trying to deal with some of those issues, but again, those are things that are largely outside of the control of the park itself. And climate change. Projections for the Southwest indicate that we are at ground zero in a lot of ways for climate change, and things are going to get hotter and drier. And the one advantage we have at Grand Canyon is because it's such a large landscape and it encompasses a large altitudinal gradient, that there may be microhabitats and refugia for species to adapt to those changing climatic conditions. So in 2009, the park, recognizing all of these issues, decided to try and take a new approach towards resource management and really to take a proactive approach. And some examples include restoring functioning native plant communities. I'll describe a project in a little bit that focuses on that. Restoring native fish communities. We hired a fisheries biologist a few years ago, the first one the park's ever had, and we've had great success in translocating threatened humpback chub into tributaries within the park, and they are doing well. Restoring extirpated wildlife species. We're in the process of developing a feasibility study for potentially reintroducing northern leopard frogs back into the park. Stewarding archaeological sites. A lot of work has been done over the past few years in that regard, and a lot of you are probably familiar with the Granite archaeology project. And also enhancing the visitor experience and really understanding the socioeconomic impacts of the work we do. So I was hired, as Jan mentioned, back in November 2010, and my challenge has really been trying to get my head around all these issues and working with staff and managers and partners outside of the park to try and figure out how we can try to approach resource management within an integrated ecosystem-based framework. So this is a new project that we're just initiating now. And it's really an attempt to identify the condition of resources within the park. So currently we're developing desired conditions for the park, which basically identify those resources that we're most interested, both natural and cultural resources, and identify kind of what condition we want those resources to be in the future, 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the line. That provides kind of a framework for this landscape assessment. We've secured funding through the Park Service through the Natural Resource Condition Assessment Program and the concession franchise fees. And we're in the process of formalizing a partnership with Professor Tom Sisk here at NAU and his Lab of Landscape Ecology and Conservation Biology, as well as Conservation Science Partners, which is a new nonprofit organization that, with some staff that are from Professor Sisk's lab. So the basic concept is to take a landscape scale approach, interdisciplinary approach, spatially explicit and collaborative. So we'll be assessing conditions of a suite of resources, both natural and cultural. We'll be identifying trends in those resources and threats to those resources as well. And the ultimate goal is to develop a map that identifies high priority areas for management. Through that process, we'll also identify data gaps, and that will help direct research that both the park conducts and other organizations conduct to help answer our management questions. This is a schematic that was developed through Professor Sisk's lab. They have done these types of landscape assessments through the Forest Era project. And what you see here is a kind of outline for the project. We've got collaboration. In the science, you're basically combining a bunch of different layers. Think of it wildlife, cultural, caves, springs, and combining those along with qualitative input from different stakeholders and identifying those areas that are of high priority. So within a conceptual framework, you can think of, for any given resource, you can have the value of the resource, and that could be based on quantitative data and or qualitative input, and also the level of risk associated with that given resource. And as a manager, you're going to want to focus your efforts, because you've got limited resources in terms of time, staff, and money, in these areas where you have high value resources that are at a high level of risk. So here's an example of a landscape assessment that was conducted in northern New Mexico, and you can see on the left you have values that were identified through the process I described. Then you have the risks, and when you overlay those, you can identify those priority areas. Now, the simplest way to think about that is just spatially overlaying those different resources, those areas where you have the highest coincident number of resources and the highest level of threats are where you would focus your efforts. There are much more complex ways to analyze and model those different spatial layers, and we'll be exploring those different methods as part of this landscape assessment. So we're just in the early phases of this project. We're in the process of doing outreach, and it'll be an iterative process that will involve many steps. We'll be engaging stakeholders and subject matter experts through expert workshops. We'll be taking an inventory of what information is available readily, both spatial and tabular. We'll be identifying what specific suite of resources that we'll be focusing our efforts on based on what available information is there, and then really assessing the conditions of those resources and trends. So I'm going to narrow my focus now to the Colorado River corridor and talk about some of the issues there. So most of you are probably familiar. Glen Canyon Dam is upstream of Grand Canyon National Park. It was completed in 1966, and it's had a significant impact on the resources within the river corridor. It's dramatically changed the hydrology of the river. Before the dam, there were large and relatively frequent flood events. There was also a large amount of sediment that entered the system from upstream. We know since the dam has been put in place that about 95% of the historic sediment load is now trapped behind Glen Canyon Dam in Lake Powell, and that has had a significant impact on resources downstream. We also know that water temperatures have changed dramatically, and overall it's a much colder river, which has favored non-native species like trout, and at the expense of native species that evolved in an overall warmer river. We also know that the riparian community has been dramatically altered. I'll talk about this in a few slides as well. And also user impacts. Because of the high level of use we have And because within the river corridor that use is concentrated in relatively small areas, it has resulted in some significant degradation at those sites. So we've got issues with social trails and illegal camps, improper disposal of trash and human waste, and just general disturbance created by visitors, both for wildlife and other visitors as well. So this slide shows a picture that was taken in 1890 by Robert Stanton. He was on a mission to survey the canyon with the intention of potentially putting a railroad through the canyon. Thankfully, that never occurred. But you can see this is a Granite rapid. It's at River Mile 95 on the left, and it's basically devoid of vegetation. And that was, again, due to the large, relatively frequent floods that occurred before the dam was put in place. Now in 1990, you can see that there is more vegetation there, I mean significantly more. The reason why you don't actually see more here than you might expect is in 1984, there was some relatively large snow and rain events in the upper Colorado River Basin, and Lake Powell is at the risk of overtopping the dam. And so they released large quantities of water on the order of about 90,000 cubic feet per second. That's about twice the magnitude of the high flow events, experimental events that have occurred since then. But it was only about a 25-year flood in terms of the historical flood regime. So those could get over 200,000 cubic feet per second. Now, going to 2010, Bob Webb revisited these located these exact photo points, and has a whole series of photos, of repeat photos from the Stanton photos. And you can see in 2010 that there is significantly more vegetation. And this site is pretty typical of a lot of sites along the river. Now, the reason why that is that conditions favor a lot of vegetation. And if you think back to that pattern process paradigm I talked about, the things you see in the natural world are there for a reason. And our job as ologists are to kind of figure out the how, the why, the where, the when, and most importantly as managers, the so what. So most people would consider things, conditions before the dam came as a natural ecosystem. Now, 2010, we have what some would consider a novel ecosystem. It's a relatively new concept in ecology that recognizes that a lot of ecosystems are very different from what they were historically, and they're largely different due to the presence of non-native species. Now, what's interesting is if you talk about the concept of restoration, it implies that you want to go back in time. And if we did have a pair of magic slippers like Dorothy, we might be able to do that, and we could all find ourselves back to Shangri-La in 1959 before the dam was put in place. But that's not really possible. So more realistically, we like to use the terms rehabilitation or recovery or stewardship. The way I like to think about it is rehabilitation or recovery is moving maybe back towards more historic conditions, but you know you're not going to quite get there. And stewardship is maybe a bit more forward-looking. So you have this guy scratching his head next to a graph of climate change. And so you really want to start thinking forward and thinking about what is the system likely to support. There's no point in trying to restore something back to a condition that isn't likely to be maintained under the current conditions. So the river corridor picture is further complicated by the tamarisk and tamarisk leaf beetle. Most of you are probably familiar, tamarisk is a non-native species that has come to dominate riparian areas in the Southwest. The reason why we don't like tamarisk is that it outcompetes native vegetation, it degrades native wildlife habitat, and it alters stream hydrology. And for those of you who have been down the river, the corridor is heavily dominated by tamarisk. Also, the side canyons are as well. And in about the early 2000s, the park decided to make a concerted effort to try and control and remove tamarisk in the side canyons. That's been a largely successful project, thanks to the hard work of hundreds of volunteers, spending thousands of hours hiking up canyons and cutting down tamarisk.